This compassionate man rescued an abandoned, starving dog that was on the brink of death. Thankfully, its angel in human form arrived just in time to save its life. After several months of dedicated care, the man discovers the dog's owner, only to be shocked by the owner's identity and the reason for abandoning the dog. Stay tuned to find out what happens next, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any new stories. Richard was a man in his early 40s who worked at a prominent tech firm in his hometown. As a father of two beautiful princesses, one of the things that Richard always did in his free time was take his young daughters to the park. In the past, Richard and his daughters would go to the park almost every weekend, but after he got a new job at a tech firm, Richard tried as much as possible to take his daughters there at least twice a month. Like every other father, Richard enjoyed watching his daughters have fun and play around. Sometimes he would take them to the park for a father-daughter date, and other times he would take them there for a play date with other kids. Aside from taking his daughters to the park on weekends, Richard and his wife would try to do something fun and engaging for them, like taking them on a picnic, visiting the zoo, or giving them a lunch or dinner treat at their favorite restaurant. Though mostly busy, the two parents always did their best to make time for their daughters. Even though Richard enjoyed taking his daughters to other places, he preferred to take them to the park because it reminded him of his childhood, and he could think about other things apart from work. For Richard, going to the park often was his way of relaxing and enjoying the sight of happy children playing around. One summer holiday, Richard and his wife were at home one weekend when his wife suggested that they go for a picnic at the park. Richard's wife was a nurse, and she had just returned from her night shift a couple of hours before she made that suggestion. She had been working overtime in the past few days, so she suggested a picnic to compensate their daughters for being away most of the time. Without hesitation, Richard and his wife began to plan their picnic, and around 4:00 p.m. that evening, they all arrived at the park. As expected, it was filled with lots of children playing around, and there were also other families having a picnic. 2 hours after Richard, his wife, and his daughters had settled down, Richard grew tired of sitting, so he told his wife that he was going to go on a short walk around the park and asked her to watch the kids. Since Richard had been there many times, he knew his way quite well around the park. But then, about 10 minutes after Richard walked away from his wife and kids, he made a shocking discovery. He spotted a sickly German Shepherd dog hanging around the park. To Richard, seeing a dog in the park wasn't weird or out of the ordinary because that day many families came with their dogs to the park. But when Richard saw that dog, he immediately suspected that something was wrong. First, the dog was very emaciated and starved, and it looked very sick. From the way that the dog looked around, it also appeared lost. To confirm his suspicion, Richard tried to check to see if the dog was with anyone, but after watching the dog for minutes, he realized that the dog had likely lost its way or the owner had abandoned it just to die. Aside from the dog being in bad shape, it looked very weak and couldn't even walk or stand well because it had injured its right leg. At first, Richard thought of buying some hot dogs for it, but when he walked closer to the dog, he saw that it was on the brink of death. Even though Richard was not a dog lover, merely seeing the dog in that state shattered his heart. Richard knew that if he didn't do anything to save the dog immediately, the dog would not survive another day in that condition. Without wasting time, Richard called his wife and told her about the abandoned dog he had found. His family ended the picnic because Richard had to take the dog to the vet. When Richard and his family got to the veterinary clinic, the vet told them that the dog had to remain under their care for a while so they could watch it and take care of it properly. Due to the compassion in his heart for this poor and sick dog, Richard covered the costs of the dog's treatment and left it at the vet. Initially, when Richard paid for the dog to be treated, he expected that the dog would get well after the treatment. However, the dog had to stay at the vet longer than Richard expected because it relapsed into a critical condition several times, almost dying each time. As a result, Richard had to keep covering the treatment expenses until the dog fully recovered. After the dog recovered, Richard was happy and relieved because, in the past few months of constantly visiting the dog, he had grown fond of his new friend and wanted it to stay alive and healthy at all costs. A few days after the dog was fit to be taken home, Richard knew he had to find the original owner because he didn't know anything about the dog, not even its name. Unknown to Richard, he was about to make a shocking discovery that would change the course of his relationship with the dog. To find out who the dog's owner was, Richard had to do some digging, which led him back to the same area where he found the dog. Thankfully, with the help of the police, Richard found a security camera from a gas station not too far from the park. The security camera recorded a man throwing the dog out of a moving car. The police were able to identify the owner by the car's license plate, and when they did, everyone was shocked. It turned out that the dog's former owner was a high-ranking official who worked for the state army. The dog had been his service dog during his service, which he had been allowed to take home afterward. Despite the many years of loyal service the dog had shown him, the owner showed no gratitude. Over time, the dog had gotten too old and was only a burden in terms of time and money, so the owner thought the right thing to do was to throw the dog on the roadside like some piece of garbage. Initially, the reason Richard decided to find the dog's owner was so that the owner could take the dog back. Richard didn't want to take in the dog because his daughters were still very young, and he didn't think he would have time for pets. But after he heard the heartbreaking story of how the ungrateful owner abandoned the dog when it needed care and attention the most, he couldn't help but take in the dog. Richard had already grown fond of the dog, and the dog had grown close to him, showing him so much love and gratitude. Also, his wife and daughters loved the dog and had given him the name Frank. So when Richard decided to finally adopt the dog, his family supported the decision. Today, Frank is a healthy dog who is well cared for and loved by his new family. Richard's kindness made him different from the dog's former owner. Sadly, the previous owner abandoned the dog when it needed help the most despite its loyalty. Thanks to Richard's compassion, the dog now has a loving home and will spend its last days knowing it is cherished.